All right, let's focus on international matters now. The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas seems to be holding after the latest conflict claimed lives on both sides. Israeli politicians and military commanders say their airstrikes did serious damage to what they are calling the infrastructure of terror, from buildings to underground installations. But Hamas leaders and fighters were targeted and killed. But they're also saying they see themselves as a winner. They say it has demonstrated to Palestinians that Hamas is prepared to fight for their rights in Jerusalem and take on the might of Israel. But the ceasefire is merely a pause in an unending conflict. We are joined now by Daniel Pomerantz, who's the CEO of Honest Reporting and is based in Israel. Daniel, welcome to our program and thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Even as this ceasefire seems to be holding for now, a permanent resolution to this conflict, some might say, seems as remote as ever.
Well, you know, the founding charter of the Hamas organization says that its reason for existence is to destroy the state of Israel and murder Jews globally. It actually says that in the document. It's like their constitution or their Declaration of Independence. And it would actually be a significant source of shame if they were to stop at anything less than that. So the only way that this resolves, both for the Jewish people and the Arab people and the Palestinian people, is if Hamas either ends up being completely reformed as an organization or taken out of power. A lot of people don't realize that the legitimate government of the Palestinian people is the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is actually a rival of the Palestinian Authority and controls the Palestinian people within the area of Gaza. So they're really not seen as legitimate even among the Palestinian people, and certainly not in the wider world.
Is the two-state plan still viable?
I believe so. It's, you just need to have, you know, here on the ground, there are so many people who really believe in coexistence, and we see it every day. We see it in our friends and our neighbors and our relationships, but those don't make headlines because it's not exciting news to say, hey, today in Israel, a couple of people got along. You're never going to hear that. But I think it represents most people. I think it represents most desires. And it may be naively optimistic of me, but I think it's going to win in the end because it's the only thing that can.
But we've seen tensions within Israel in the last conflict between citizens of Arab and Jewish descent in Israel. Some would say there's been a steady rise in the influence of Israeli political factions that want an expansion over Jerusalem, the annexation of various parts of the West Bank. And of course, as more Palestinian territory is taken, one would argue the two-state solution seems less viable.
It's actually a misunderstanding of both history and maps. There are, you know, there's an expression that in Israel, you get 10 Israelis, you're going to get 12 opinions. And there are different groups that want different things. But the portion of the West Bank that was offered to the Palestinian government in the last several offers, and there have been at least 3 or 4 in the last 10 years, have ranged around 97% of the West Bank. Israel has completely left Gaza and is present in 0% of Gaza. In terms of what different political groups desire, of course, there's a range. In terms of what happens on the ground, the Palestinian government controls as much territory as it has over at any point in the last 10 to 20 years. And to create an independent, viable Palestinian state, it would still take the negotiations would still take the same form that they had at any point in the past.
But with the blockades continuing, with the restrictions, with no control of their airspace and borders, right down to what Palestinians may or may not consume. I mean, here in South Africa, we know what apartheid looks like. We know a Bantustan when we see one.
Yeah, you know, I know South Africans understand apartheid better than anyone and understand the suffering of it and the deep loss of it. And I certainly wouldn't presume to speak about that. What I can speak to is what I see here in Israel. Within Israel, Palestinians sit as justices of the Supreme Court, as members of parliament, of the Knesset. One of the largest, strongest political parties right now is an Arab party. Palestinians are doctors and lawyers and actors and movie stars and fighter pilots and police officers and everything that Israelis do. So without presuming to speak myself about what apartheid is or isn't, I would just say that perhaps all South Africans with this deep and painful memory might think back and ask oneself, is what I'm describing something that sounds to you like what apartheid was? Perhaps you might find the answer is surprising.
Well, no less than Human Rights Watch has condemned the acts of the Israeli government, the arbitrary arrests and illegal imprisonment of one racial group, the population being divided at times along racial lines, the creation of urban ghettos for one group, the expropriation of property, forced removals. Those are things we are familiar with.
Well, Human Rights Watch actually changed the definition of apartheid in order to try and make it apply to Israel. In fact, they specifically said in their document, we are abandoning the definition of apartheid that is understood in South Africa and putting together a new one of our own. And they took several different documents from different places and put together this new definition. And they also took their data from groups that are openly and proudly agenda-driven groups, but not groups that are working toward bringing unbiased information. And so the report really was not a report that can be taken in a reliable way. But I think the important thing to realize is that, there are a lot of Palestinians who understand what I'm saying and say it as well. And just last week, Palestinian-Israeli journalist Khaled Abu Toameh wrote in the Jerusalem Post that 43 Palestinians in Gaza had been arrested by Hamas for the crime of, and I quote, spreading rumors. And that's what happens when people try to speak out, even to an NGO like Human Rights Watch. Now, I don't know what's going to happen to those 43 Palestinians, but in the past, when people are arrested for things like that, Hamas usually either blindfolds them and throws them off the top of a building or chains them to a motorcycle and drags them to their death through the streets of Gaza. My question is, who's speaking up for those Palestinians? Because those are the people who both need our help and deserve our help. Those are the people who are going to work together with Jews and Israelis to bring about a better future for all of us. And those are the people who are suffering under an organization that is not recognized even by the Palestinian government as a legitimate governing body.
Daniel Pomerantz, the CEO of Honest Reporting, based in Jerusalem.